Hello, this is Dr. Kat Vlies again from Central New Mexico Community College. We're going to continue our discussion of the digestive system. This time we'll focus on the stomach and we will refer to this as video F. Let's first take a look at the gross anatomy of the stomach. The esophagus, of course, turns into the stomach, so essentially the stomach is just a dilated tube, a temporary dilation of a tube we call it the stomach, and then when the stomach turns back into a tube we call it the small intestine. The beginning of the small intestine, or the most proximal part of the small intestine, we call the duodenum or duodenum, either way. You can pronounce it either way. The stomach is somewhat banana-shaped, with this being the lesser curvature, and this we refer to as the greater curvature. And some of those fatty mesenteries that we learned about before, the lesser omentum is attached to the lesser curvature, and the greater omentum is going to be attached to this greater curvature. We'll see that on pictures later on. We can divide the stomach up into major regions. So where the cardiac sphincter is located, that functional sphincter where the esophagus enters into the stomach, we have the cardia area. So nearby this cardiac sphincter, we have the cardia or the cardiac region. It's hard to really point to the cardiac sphincter because it's not an anatomical sphincter muscle, which is different from this sphincter that we see at the distal end of the stomach, at the junction between the stomach and the duodenum. There we see a real thickening of the smooth muscle of the muscularis externa to create a sphincter called the pyloric sphincter that controls how much content of the stomach will end up in the duodenum. And by the way, this region nearby that pyloric sphincter we can call the pylorus or the pyloric canal. The majority of the stomach is just referred to as the body, so most of it is referred to as the body. And then we finally have this bump here, which is referred to as the fundus. The fundus serves as a storage area. So the stomach doesn't only function in the churning of the food, that is the mechanical digestion. We're going to see that it is involved in chemical digestion, but it also plays a role in the storage of food. Now, just like like we learned about the digestive tract, we're going to see the four typical tunics in the stomach, with the mucosa being the inner layer, followed by the submucosa, the muscularis externa, and since the stomach is an intraperitoneal structure, we see a serosa, the peritoneal serosa, obviously. But let's say a few more words about the muscularis externa. In most instances, we see just two layers. That is a longitudinal and a circular layer, with the circular layer being typically on the inside, with the longitudinal layer being more superficial. But in the stomach, we have an additional layer called the oblique layer. And this time it's the oblique layer that sits the deepest, with the circular layer following, and then finally the longitudinal layer. So we see these three muscle layers, smooth muscle layers in that muscularis externa right there. Of course, this additional muscle layer, that oblique layer, is going to help with the churning of the food that the stomach is so good at. So here then we see some great pictures that illustrate the locations of the omenta. We have a greater omentum and we have a lesser omentum. And recall that our stomach, which we see right here, has a greater curvature and a lesser curvature. The greater curvature is the origin site for what we call the greater omentum. Remember, that is a modified mesentery that is very fatty and very vascularized. the greater omentum literally forms this apron across all of our viscera, digestive viscera and other viscera in that abdominal cavity, and then it tucks underneath the intestines to finally attach itself to the abdominal wall. So that is the greater omentum. The lesser omentum is going to arise from the lesser curvature, and we don't really see it on this picture that I'm pointing to now, but I'm going to tell you that it starts here from the lesser curvature and then stretches across to go attach to the big liver that we see here. And when it does that, it covers up some major blood vessels. So in the picture on the right, again, we see here the stomach with the greater curvature and then the fatty greater omentum. And then here, from the lesser curvature, we see the lesser omentum connecting to the liver. Tucked underneath the liver, by the way, we find the gallbladder. This greater omentum, by the way, is where many of us, unfortunately, store a lot of our visceral fat and put on weight in that particular area. Our stomach has many functions, and we already mentioned food storage, mechanical and chemical digestion. More specifically, the chemical digestion of proteins begins in the stomach. When the stomach churns the food and breaks it up chemically, what ultimately forms that liquid content that the stomach ends up with is called chyme. So we're going to use that term quite a bit, chyme. The stomach also produces intrinsic factor. Remember, that is a hormone that we need in order to absorb vitamin B. And we need vitamin B, vitamin B12 in particular, to go through cell divisions, which is so important in hematopoiesis. Now, we can do without the stomach as long as a person is supplemented with intrinsic factor. And the reason for this is that there is absolutely very little absorption of food in the stomach. So we often think that the stomach plays a big role in absorbing food into our blood. That is not the case. Very few things are absorbed in the stomach. For instance, aspirin is, and alcohol, and probably just a few more things, but really very little. Don't forget that. Most absorption actually occurs in the small intestine. So let's learn now how the stomach is innervated and how it is nourished and how its wastes are removed. So the nerves that innervate the stomach include the vagus nerves, which carry parasympathetic fibers into the stomach and stimulate the stomach to contract and or secrete. Remember, the parasympathetic nervous system is what stimulates your digestive system. But we also have sympathetic fibers present in something we call the splanchnic nerves. And of course, sympathetic fibers are going to inhibit digestion. Now, in addition to those nerves, we have what we call the splanchnic circulation, which includes blood vessels that provide nourishment, as well as blood vessels that drain the stomach. Arising directly from the aorta, there is a small trunk called the celiac trunk, which immediately gives rise to three major branches. The left gastric artery, guess where that goes? The hepatic artery, you can imagine where that goes, and the splenic artery. These are the three major branches of the celiac trunk, which is a direct branch or trunk of the aorta. In just a moment, I will enlarge the picture on our right to better illustrate this. We also see that there are two arteries that arise directly from the aorta, called the inferior and superior mesenteric arteries, that also help supply the stomach. The hepatic portal circulation is going to drain part of the stomach. So here then we're looking at a zoomed in image of the celiac trunk, which is a direct branch of the abdominal aorta. So back here we see the abdominal aorta. It sits retroperitoneally along with the pancreas. Remember, this is the lesser curvature of the stomach, from where we typically would see the lesser omentum arise to connect with the liver, which has been mostly cut away here, which is why we can see the gallbladder. So if we remove that lesser omentum here, we can see the abdominal aorta, we can even see the inferior vena cava and the hepatic portal vein. We'll talk about those structures later on. But arising from that abdominal aorta, we have this short trunk called the celiac trunk, which immediately branches to give rise to the left gastric artery, which nourishes our stomach. It also gives rise to the splenic artery. This diagram gives this a Latin name, but this is the splenic artery that goes all the way to the spleen, which sits in your left hypochondriac region of the abdominopelvic cavity, tucked underneath the left part of your rib cage. And then there's the hepatic artery, which of course goes and feeds the liver. These two pictures focus on the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. Right here we see the superior mesenteric artery. You can't tell, but it actually arises from the aorta, and all of its branches are extremely extensive, therefore supplying nutrients to all kinds of digestive structures, including to some extent the stomach. And then here we have the inferior mesenteric artery arising from the lower portion of the abdominal aorta. The stomach and all of these other digestive structures, the intestines, etc., and the spleen, pancreas, they all need to be drained as well. The wastes need to be removed. And so we see here the inferior mesenteric vein, which collects a lot of the blood from the large intestine and the more distal small intestine. Here we have the superior mesenteric vein. So both of these veins are going to merge along with the splenic vein, which actually collects some of the blood from the stomach here. So splenic, inferior mesenteric, superior mesenteric, they all merge to eventually form the hepatic portal vein. The hepatic portal vein is a vein that has collected blood from all of these digestive structures. That blood is oxygen poor, but it's very nutrient rich. And this is why it is going into the liver. So it's going into this direction. So blood is draining all of these structures, the intestines, the stomach, the spleen. It's collected by the hepatic portal vein, and then it is going to be processed by the liver. All of these vessels are referred to as the hepatic portal circulation, which we will come back to when we study the liver. We're now finally moving on to the microscopic anatomy of the stomach, where we can learn about the cells that act as little glands, in the sense that they produce secretions or hormones that are involved in digestion. The secretions that they form are going to be able to form something we refer to as gastric juice, and they together form what we call gastric glands that are primarily concentrated in the fundus and the body of the stomach. So remember that when we switch over from the esophagus to the stomach, the epithelial tissue switches abruptly from stratified squamous epithelial tissue in the esophagus to simple columnar with goblet cells in the stomach. And notice that the epithelium is not all straight, it is very invaginated. So here we have an invagination, here's another invagination, and another invagination. And we refer to these invaginations along with all of the cells that form that invagination as a gastric gland. Now, the opening into a gastric gland, which is what is shown here with these circles, are referred to as the gastric pits. So a gastric gland is made up of many little cells that are part of that simple columnar epithelial tissue. And some of these cells have very specialized functions. So we're going to have to take a look at that. Otherwise, the histology of the stomach, as mentioned before, follows the typical tunics. That is, we have our mucosa with its 3 sublayers, the submucosa. The musculaire is slightly unusual in that we have the additional oblique layer. And then, of course, the most superficial layer is the serosa. There are 4 distinct cells that form these gastric glands, and one of these is not marked on the diagram. It's called the mucous neck cell. The reason for why it is not marked here is because it's not extremely well understood what exactly their function is. So we'll focus instead on the parietal cells. Notice that they sit closest to the beginning of our gastric gland, closest to where the gastric pit is formed. We have chief cells, and then we have enteroendocrine cells. And as you can imagine, based on the name, these are cells that secrete hormones. Remember, we mentioned intrinsic factor earlier. Well, it is these parietal cells that are responsible for making this particular hormone. But when it comes to actual digestive functions, the parietal cells are the ones that secrete hydrochloric acid, a very acidic compound which keeps the interior of the stomach at a pH close to 2. So pretty darn acidic. And as you can imagine, that is going to help with the killing of all kinds of pathogens, the denaturing of proteins, so we begin the chemical digestion of proteins, and we can see that the HCl can even break down cell walls of plant cells, even the tough connective tissues, those fibers, collagen fibers in the meat. The hydrochloric acid is also needed by the chief cells, because it's the chief cells that produce something called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen can be converted into pepsin to digest proteins, but in order for it to become activated into pepsin, it requires HCl. So again, it's the chief cells that secrete pepsinogen. But for pepsinogen to become the activated form called pepsin, we need HCl, or hydrochloric acid. Now, once pepsin is produced, it can actually feed back upon itself to produce more pepsin. And there's no need for the hydrochloric acid anymore once some of the pepsin has been produced. The chief cells also produce something called gastric lipase. Recall that our tongue produces something called lingual lipase, and anything that ends in an ASE refers to an enzyme, which is where pepsin is kind of unusual. It doesn't have that ASE sound at the end. But lingual lipase, along with gastric lipase, both of these enzymes help with the digestion of fats. Now, fats require quite a bit of work to be broken down chemically, which we will look at later, but these are a couple of enzymes that can get things started. Finally, we get to the enteroendocrine cells, which are primarily concentrated near the very bottom of our gastric gland, and as the name says, these are cells that produce hormones. These hormones are going to end up into the capillaries of the lamina propria. Remember, that's the loose connective tissue that sits just deep to the simple columnar epithelial tissue, so right about here. It is very vascularized, and these hormones can have different functions. They can either stimulate digestion or they can actually inhibit digestion. We will look at some examples of those hormones. In children, finally, we see that the gastric glands also produce something called renin. Now, this is not to be confused with renin that is spelled with just one N that we've learned about the renin-angiotensin mechanism we've already learned a little bit about in the respiratory system. We'll come back to it in the urinary system. But the renin, spelled with two N's, is something very different, and it's produced by children only, and it helps with the digestion of a milk protein called casein. Let's take a look at some of the hormones produced by the enteroendocrine cells that we find especially near the bottom of the gastric glands. We definitely need to mention gastrin. Gastrin is a hormone we'll talk quite a bit about. It's a hormone that is produced by the stomach, and it can affect the stomach itself, but also notice that it affects several other structures: the small intestine, the large intestine, and then a sphincter muscle or a valve that we see at the junction between the small and the large intestine. What triggers the release of gastrin is going to be partially digested proteins, that is, peptides and amino acids. The ultimate result is that we're going to see an increase in the secretion of the gastric glands, and we also see that the smooth muscles start to contract so that the stomach can empty itself. And we see similar functions at the level of the intestines. We see especially that the muscles are stimulated to contract. Ghrelin is another hormone produced by the stomach mucosa. It is particularly going to be triggered by a fasting state, and it ultimately tells the hypothalamus, hey, it's time for us to start eating again. Histamine, another very common hormone that we've mentioned in various instances in relation to blood vessels, in relation to the respiratory system. This is also produced by the stomach mucosa in response to the presence of food, and it's going to stimulate the stomach itself to start releasing hydrochloric acid by the parietal cells. Serotonin, also produced by the enteroendocrine cells, impacts the stomach to start contracting. So far, the hormones that we've listed were all stimulating hormones. They all either promoted the secretion of the gastric glands, for instance, or promoted contraction of smooth muscle. But as you know, there are always going to be factors that stimulate versus inhibit. So somatostatin is going to be more of an inhibitory factor or inhibitory hormone for the digestive system. It's going to be responding to the presence, or it's being released in response to the presence of food in the stomach. We notice too that the sympathetic nervous system can play a role. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system tends to inhibit digestion, such that the stomach is going to stop secreting, is going to stop contracting. Same with the small intestine, more or less. We're going to see that there's going to be a reduction in the absorption due to less blood flow as we start to see more of a vasoconstriction response, and the pancreas is also going to reduce its secretions. As you can imagine, the secretion of hydrochloric acid needs to be regulated pretty closely. So the factors that can stimulate the production of hydrochloric acid are acetylcholine, histamine, and gastrin. This all works through a mechanism that we refer to as a second messenger system. We will look at second messenger systems more closely when we get to the endocrine system. You might have been introduced to it when you learned more about neurotransmitters. Essentially what it means is that the first messenger is going to be one of these three listed above, which in turn activates a second messenger, which ultimately leads to the production of the hydrochloric acid. We can block the secretion of hydrochloric acid, by the way, with the help of antihistamines or anything that prevents the pumping of hydrogen ions. Remember too that the pH of the stomach on average is around 2, give or take a little bit. We'll use a diagram on the next slide to better understand how hydrochloric acid is secreted. Just like active pepsin enzyme can't be floating around in the stomach at all times because it would literally start digesting the stomach wall itself, hydrochloric acid cannot either. So hydrochloric acid is only produced when it is triggered to be released. As we learned, histamine, gastrin, and acetylcholine are definite triggers, but how exactly is it produced? Well, we're going to have to go back to that famous chemical equation we learned about in the respiratory system. Recall that when carbon dioxide and water combine, often with the help of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which we see being present in our parietal cell, we can form carbonic acid, and that can quickly dissociate then into bicarbonate ions as well as hydrogen ions. And let's stop there for a moment. First of all, the carbon dioxide can come in from the interstitial fluid, from the blood capillary, or it might even be present inside of the parietal cell. After all, the parietal cell metabolizes constantly and probably puts out some carbon dioxide. The carbonic anhydrase enzyme is present in the parietal cell, catalyzing the reaction between carbon dioxide and water. These hydrogen ions are going to be pumped out with the help of an ATPase pump. These hydrogen ions are now going to help form our hydrochloric acid. But so where does the chloride come from? Well, recall from the respiratory system that our bicarbonate ions can actually trade places with chloride ions, and that's exactly what we see happening across the wall of our parietal cell, the wall that faces our capillary. So the capillary now takes away bicarbonate ions, while our parietal cell now allows for the transfer of chloride into the lumen. The hydrogen from the hydrogen potassium ATPase pump and the chloride are going to combine to form hydrochloric acid. By the way, this is again a figure I borrowed from one of the Pearson textbooks, so thank you to the Pearson Publishing Company. There's an interesting consequence of the formation of the hydrochloric acid, and that is the collection of bicarbonate ions in the capillary blood that is leaving the stomach. By collecting these bicarbonate ions, we're literally making the blood that leaves the stomach more alkaline. So in the lumen, we're creating a very acidic environment, while in the blood, we're creating more of an alkaline environment. So literally, we create this alkaline tide, meaning the blood that leaves the stomach is alkaline. We're going to come back to this alkaline tide because it's going to play an important role when we talk about the kinds of secretions that the pancreas produces. So keep this in mind. With these protein digesting products that the stomach produces, you think that the stomach is constantly being threatened of being digested itself. Well, we learned that pepsinogen has to be activated, and hydrochloric acid literally has to be built by the cells of the stomach wall, but still, we find some additional protective mechanisms. For instance, we see that there is a thick coating of alkaline mucus, a mucus that is rich in bicarbonate ions. These bicarbonate ions in the body play a very important role in many, many parts of the body, as we'll continue to see. So that alkaline mucus protects the inner lining of the stomach. We also see that the cells of the simple columnar epithelial tissue have tight junctions in between them, making it very difficult for molecules to slip in between the cells. The molecules, the compounds, would literally have to move through the epithelial cells to make it to the blood. And in order for that to happen, typically they would have to depend on some special transport mechanism, and if that isn't present, they're not going to get anywhere. Notice too that deep within the gastric glands, we find that the cells are actually impermeable to hydrochloric acid. And if none of that is really doing a good enough job, the stomach literally replaces its epithelial layer in less than a week. So every few days to about a week, your whole stomach's lining and actually the rest of your gut is replaced. And of course, by replacing these epithelial cells so rapidly, it's easy to replace the damaged epithelial cells. It's analogous to what our skin does, essentially. There's one more video on the stomach, so we're not quite done discussing the stomach.